Welcome to the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode features a different topic and a guest who shares their experience and knowledge with us. Tune in and learn something new with BankTalk podcast.
Hi, and welcome to BankTalk. I'm Rich Carty, your host and head of sales at Remedy Consulting. I'm honored to host our 100th episode of BankTalk and want to thank all of our loyal listeners out there who have made BankTalk the most downloaded podcast in the community bank and credit union space. As you may know by now, Charlie Kelly, our host, has asked a few of us at Remedy to find some topics that are of interest to us and share the hosting opportunities at BankTalk. So I'm going to spend some time here today with Charlie to learn a little bit more about the journey to get to the 100 episodes and a few things he's learned about the bank and credit union industry since becoming a podcaster. And if all goes well, hopefully I'll be able to host again in the future. We'll kick that off. Charlie, welcome back. Thanks for joining me here today as a guest for BankTalk.
How are you doing?
Not too bad. Yourself?
No, good. No, thanks for the intro. I think it's interesting that this is, I believe, the first time we've ever tried video.
Well, obviously, we've been doing it for a few years now, since hosting BankTalk. Why don't we talk a little bit about how it got started?
Sure. Yeah, we started BankTalk. I think we're going on our fourth year now. So it came up as an idea, podcasting was a little newer back then. Everybody seemed to have a blog. The way we were thinking about it back then is we thought, a blog, you can prepare a blog, but you don't really know who's reading it. The interesting thing about being a podcaster is somebody's got to go get your content in order for you to, right? So if your content's crap, then, obviously it becomes, one of those things where if your content's crap, you're not going to be in business long enough. So, we're kind of fortunate that I believe us to still be the most downloaded podcast in the space. In the time we've been doing it, we learned a lot. Hopefully we've, content's getting better. Our marketing folks have pushed the video thing. And on my side of it, I always thought, I don't want to be the guy who said, who the hell's ever going to use TV or streaming or, every technology breakthrough that's ever been out there. I don't want to be the old guy that says, oh, no, that's a terrible idea. We always thought of the podcast as something you listen to on the way home. Video side of it, certainly I think there's a group of folks that appreciate doing it at work as well and listening at work. So.
Yeah, definitely a good way to reach out and have some learning opportunities along the way as well.
So, I guess probably in answer to your question, we started this thing out saying, okay, do we have enough content in our space to do a podcast? And our space is, as you probably well know at Remedy, a pretty narrow niche. So rather than go to the narrow niche, we said, you know what, we're going to do two things. We're going to try to see if we can stay 5 episodes ahead. We're always going to try to find 5 interesting episodes, and we're going to concentrate on the things that we don't know about banking in the credit union space. And at the time, and even probably now, if you're humble enough, you always say to yourself, hopefully there's a lot more things I need to learn than the things that I actually know today. With that in mind, we thought, well, let's go find 5 interesting topics. And if we can always stay 5 interesting topics out, we'll continue to have a podcast. And here we are at podcast number 100. Yeah. Try to keep it halfway educational, halfway entertaining. We said that to ourselves, and hopefully we're accomplishing that as we move along.
Absolutely. And hey, cheers to 100. Cheers to you, to Remedy, and BankTalk for 100.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome milestone. So, Charlie, what else have you learned from the podcasting space that might be interesting to our listeners?
One thing I guess I never thought about, not being much of a social media person, it never occurred to me that once you become somewhat popular, like once you get a few downloads, you end up with public relations people who could come to you to ask, if their person can be a guest on the show. And knowing PR, it has, I'm sure has to do with trying to show yourself as an industry expert. Generally speaking, those folks will come and they'll say, this is what Bob or Sally is good at. we decided that we were going to take that information and we were going to not use their content. We were going to use their expertise. And then we were going to try to come up with questions that we thought the listeners might have some interest in. So as an example, Bob's an expert in AI. Well, AI is a big field. Bob can talk about these 5 things is usually how that material comes from the public relations firm. And usually what we try to do is we try to take that and say, well, there's a specific part of AI I think our listeners would want to hear about. Here's 4 or 5 questions to get to a 20-minute podcast.
Yeah.
Now, the downside of that is sometimes the expert isn't an expert in the things you're trying to ask them. So we do try to challenge them, challenge our experts, and again, some of these experts are vendors, and so they have a message, right? We try to take the message away and try to ask the right questions. And sometimes the problem with that we found is if the expert is not prepared or the expert does not really know the answer to your question, you end up with a lot of generic sounding babble on your podcast. And there's nothing you can do as a podcast recorder to do anything about that except try to edit it out at the end. What I found is as soon as I hear a generic answer or I start hearing somebody who doesn't exactly answer the question, generally speaking, that person is not prepared and hasn't either read the questions and thought through how they're going to answer them or what have you. That to me was just unique. I mean, again, I'm sure other folks have probably listened to some of our podcasts and go, "What? That guy didn't answer the question." What I learned is you can only edit so much out before you don't have a podcast, right? Or you cut into the guts of the topic. So we do everything we can to try to edit things and keep them down to a lean podcast. I would say our editor, if they were to say, Charlie, you've done 100 of these, what could you do better? I think they probably would say, could you make it shorter? Because if you ask them, we've kind of learned if you ask them 10 questions, that might go on for an hour, and that's just too much. So we've recently even tried to keep them down to a more manageable number because your drive home is 20 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I won't be asking you 10 today. We'll leave it at that then. So I would imagine if something that was the case, they're probably not going to be invited back, or they wouldn't be of interest.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's if they come unprepared or they haven't thought through it or they can't answer it and they didn't tell us, and I'll say the thing that I see the most there is if you're asking about industry statistics, if you want to know what percentage of X, right, and they have no idea, and they come to the podcast without that information or try to twist it into some other question, that doesn't sit real well with me because that might be the reason we asked them on.
Yeah.
So, right.
Yeah. Especially for my focus, I know stats it's a big deal because you want to be able to use that in every day. So no, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think a lot of times the listeners don't, I think most listeners go about their day and they do their thing. If they're working at a bank or a credit union, they have their day job. But those stats are I always find stats fascinating because that tells you what's going on in the industry overall. And, it's super important, in my opinion.
It tells a story to some degree. What would be some of the most downloaded podcasts you've had over the past 100 and maybe some of your favorites?
Sure. Before I get into that, let me have a quick discussion on what makes an episode popular. Sometimes the guest brings the listeners. So sometimes when you see a download spike, obviously all these podcast platforms allow you to track users, track usage, some things, not 100%, but and so when you see a spike, we usually will sit around and go, why the spike? And sometimes it's the guest has enough of a following elsewhere, whether it be social media or client base or something, that they can, they bring a lot of downloads to the podcast. We try to, take that into consideration. The short answer to your question is the top 3 episodes. The first one is Banking as a Service. And that is by far the most popular episode. The only reason I can think of why Banking of a Service might be our far most popular episode, it was a good episode. But the reason I can think that might be, it wasn't because of the guests bringing their people. This one, I think, is because it's probably just a topic that people outside the banking industry might have interest in. Like they need to understand what it means, that type of thing. The second most popular topic was right around COVID when we had a couple of bank shutdowns in the country. And we actually had somebody on to talk through how you might react to that as a bank. What we thought what the regulators might be doing. And oddly, that was an episode that we didn't do it right away. We waited 3-4 weeks because everybody was talking about, the bank shutdown that was the biggest thing in the world. And we thought, well, let's let it settle a little, see if we can, kind of do a post-mortem on everything we've been hearing. That was a very popular episode. And then the third one, well, third and fourth are oddly around commercial banking. Now I think we had an episode called How to Be a Commercial Banker, or You Want to Be a Commercial Banker. We had some episodes on treasury management. Those are ones I would never have thought would have been, kind of the most popular episodes. Those are the most popular, kind of in order. The second half of your question was, what are my favorites? It doesn't apparently match up with the most popular. So I very much enjoyed some of the topics that we had done on solar tax credits. Enjoyed quite a bit we had a guy that did energy up in North Dakota. So he had an energy episode, and it was a little far off of banking, but it was fascinating to me because the way we got to that episode, we originally asked the Bankers Association if they could find us something about, how gas prices change, what the North Dakota economy comes like, or what happens in the economy in North Dakota and lending and all that. And this guy did a very good job of just kind of explaining energy and the market and et cetera. So I thought that was a great one. And maybe one of my other ones was we had a guy that did some information on office space. And the office space, so that's another one where we reached out to the Bankers Association. Office space was having a hard time because it was after COVID. And we asked a lot of folks within the industry, do you have a banker that will give us an honest discussion on what's going on in commercial real estate, specifically office space, because we knew everybody's working from home.
Right.
And we got nothing but dead space, dead air. And I think the reason for that is because they were afraid of what their customers might think. Like if they go, right, this is screwed, right? This is not going to go very well. Their customers who own the real estate might have had a problem. So we reached outside, got to a person who was head of the real estate associations, one of the real estate associations, and he did just a great job explaining sort of the puts and takes of all this, the space that's out there and how it might be affected, and and how loans were going to play into that as well. So sure. I thought he did a great job. To me, I found it. I would say I found those the most challenging episodes personally. Not challenging to record, but challenging because I found them so interesting. I learned the most in those episodes.
Absolutely. I think we've talked internally, but even to our guests listening today, or some of the more popular ones, or even some that might be better off to revisit, because when you started this 4 years ago, they might have changed and become more topical or trendy, or what the pulse looks like today might be different than what it used to. Are there anything that you can think off the top of your head, or something that might be worth revisiting and going through again?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we talk about it all the time, right? Because you don't know when you run a podcast, you don't know if somebody listened to all your episodes. You don't know if they heard that topic before, and the topic might be a year old, right? So I think we're always looking at episodes that we try to do a revisit on. Liquidity is, I've got a couple of guests that really do a good job with liquidity, so I try to revisit that occasionally. I try to revisit mergers and acquisitions every year or so, bring on a guest that just knows what's going on in the space. And then we always struggle with, AI or anything related to technology. Obviously, our podcast probably skews a little bit towards tech. And sometimes to me, it feels like we're overlapping topics where we've already covered it and the guest may not know that we've covered it. So there's a little bit of a challenge there with what you pick as far as your next set of episodes. Yeah, there's definitely some ones I think we left some stuff on the table that might go better, if we picked up the second half of the episode, even if it's a year later.
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense. So Charlie, I guess to leave our listeners not in the wait, what are some upcoming episodes or things you're planning for the future with BankTalk?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've got some personal favorites, but before I answer that, I wanted to say one interesting dynamic we didn't talk about is sometimes you have great ideas on what you want to do for the next episode, and you either can't find a guest or you can't find somebody who will answer the questions the way you want it to. I'll kind of give you some thoughts on some things I was thinking about, and let it be known that anybody who might be listening, if you have ideas, that we've got plenty of ways to reach us. So if you wouldn't mind reaching out, if you got some things we haven't talked about in the past, always open to new ideas because, we live in a bubble, all of us. So good to have somebody, it's always good to hear things that we might not be thinking about as far as trying to go find a guest for them. But I have interest in AI. I think AI is a little bit overdone in the industry, but I want to find somebody who can talk about AI fraud specifically. There's a lot of AI related to trying to cause fraud. I want to find out what AI might be available out there to stop fraud, right? Stop some of these fraudsters. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting topic.
Sure.
Really like to do something on the housing markets, affordability. I think that there's probably a tranche of the population that can't afford housing since it's gone up so much. And I just like to find somebody, again, the stats, right? I'd like to find somebody with some stats that can tell me whether I'm full of crap or not. Let me see. We had a couple other ones. Always interested in studies on, having somebody help grow their bank. I think in our pipeline of ideas, we've got maybe another 8 or 10 beyond there. We got at least one really interesting case study, but we're trying to get it through a large organization, so they've got to go through their channels before we can publish it. But that was a case study on digital and, some changes that a large bank made to digital and, what the result was. So I think that'll be an interesting one. Yeah, some of that might give you a little bit of a taste. And again, the reason I kind of caveated it with all depends if I can find the right guest.
Right.
I've had some ideas that have been on the agenda for some time, and I just can't find somebody that can speak to it the way I'd like to ask the question. So that just never gets there. So
For sure. Charlie, thanks for your time today. And more importantly, thanks for your efforts getting to 100 episodes. Kudos to you.
Yeah, no, and I certainly appreciate you helping me host today, Rich. It's been great.
Absolutely.
It's always nice to have somebody, a friendly face that's not going to ask me hard questions.
Hopefully it wasn't too painful for our audience today. But thanks again.
No, hopefully it's been informative.
Awesome. And thank you to everyone for joining this monumental episode of Bank Talk. Thanks for listening to Bank Talk today. Have a great day and keep on learning. Bye.